How does a war turn on 1.5 seconds? For a pilot, it is an eternity. It is the time it takes for an engine to die, for an enemy to acquire a target, for a life to be extinguished. And on the cold tarmac of RAF Kenly at 7:42 on the morning of March 14, 1941, this sliver of time was the singular obsession of Beatrice Shilling. She stood watching a hurricane pilot, a young man whose face she didn't know, but whose fate she felt in her hands, climb into his cockpit for what could very well be his final mission. At 32 years old, with 6 years of brilliant work at the Royal Aircraft Establishment behind her, she possessed precisely zero solutions to the mechanical flaw that was systematically killing her nation's best pilots. The numbers were a grim testament to the crisis. That week alone, the Luftwaffe had dispatched 43 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters across the Channel. RAF pilots had bravely engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. The cost was staggering. 14 Hurricanes had plummeted from the sky. 9 Spitfires had followed. The pattern was as predictable as it was deadly. A British pilot spots a German fighter. He pushes the nose of his aircraft down, entering a dive to attack. In that critical moment, his engine cuts out. The powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin coughs, sputters, and falls silent. The German fighter either escapes with ease or, far worse, circles back like a predator, putting a stream of cannon fire through the stalled British plane while its pilot fights desperately to restart his engine. Shilling had immersed herself in the tragedy. She had pored over the combat reports, her mind tracing the final moments of men she would never meet. She'd meticulously read the maintenance logs, searching for a clue. She had interviewed the haunted-looking survivors, listening as they described the sudden, terrifying silence in the cockpit. The diagnosis was brutally simple. The carburetor flooded during negative G maneuvers. It was a matter of basic physics with the most brutal of consequences. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pitched forward into a sudden dive, the fuel, governed by inertia, surged to the top of the carburetor's float chamber. For a fatal 1.5 seconds, the jet was starved. The engine died. And 1.5 seconds was more than enough time for a Messerschmitt to close 300 yards and open fire. This was a uniquely British problem. The Germans, with their advanced Daimler-Benz engines, utilized direct fuel injection. There was no float chamber to flood, no risk of fuel starvation. Their Bf-109 pilots could dive, climb, roll, and even fly inverted without their engine missing a single heartbeat. This gave them a decisive, almost unfair advantage in every single engagement. British pilots knew it. German pilots mercilessly exploited it. Squadron commanders reported it with increasing desperation. The Royal Air Force was bleeding experienced pilots faster than the training schools could ever hope to replace them. For 11 agonizing months, Shilling had dedicated her life to this problem. The esteemed engineering teams at Rolls-Royce were, of course, working on it. They were designing a sophisticated pressure carburetor, a proper, elegant solution that would completely redesign the fuel delivery system. But engineering on that scale takes time. The pressure carburetor wouldn't be ready until 1943, perhaps even 1944. The war would not wait. The pilots could not wait. And so every single morning, young men climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing that their own engines might betray them long before the Germans got the chance. Squadron Leader Davies, just 24 years old with 41 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills to his name, walked past Shilling toward his waiting Hurricane. He had reported engine failure twice in the last month, both times during combat dives. He had survived on a razor's edge of pure luck and the muscle memory of 3,000 hours of training. He gave Shilling a polite nod. She nodded back. To him, she was just a woman on the airfield, likely someone's secretary, not the carburetor specialist from Farnborough who held his life in her hands. But Shilling had not come to Kenly that morning merely to observe. She had brought something with her. A small, precisely machined brass component, so simple it seemed almost absurd. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had tested it on a bench engine for 6 grueling weeks. It worked flawlessly. But a bench test wasn't the crucible of combat. Combat was 300 miles per hour. Combat was negative G-forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death decided in 1.5 seconds. Shilling walked to her Norton motorcycle, a machine she understood as well as any engine. In her leather satchel lay the brass restrictor and a plan that would either save the Royal Air Force or abruptly end her career at Farnborough. By noon, she would know which it would be. The carburetor crisis had begun in earnest in July 1940, when the RAF switched to 100-octane fuel. This higher-grade fuel meant more boost, which in turn meant the Merlin engine could produce a staggering 1,310 horsepower instead of 1,100. The Spitfire Mark II could now hit 370 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch the Messerschmitt 109s. But the Skinner's Union carburetor, a fine piece of engineering for its time, simply couldn't handle the violent physics of high-speed combat maneuvering. Shilling understood carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, just 1 month after war was declared, and was one of only 2 women in the entire engine department. The other was a secretary. Shilling was a principal technical officer in charge of carburetor research and development. Most of the men she worked with had never met a female engineer. Some openly believed women didn't belong in such a field. Shilling didn't care what they believed. She cared about keeping pilots alive. Her expertise was not purely academic, it was visceral, born from a youth spent with grease under her fingernails. At 14, she bought her first motorcycle, a Norton. She stripped its 2-stroke engine down to its individual components, learned how every single part worked in harmony, and then meticulously rebuilt it. By 25, she was racing that same Norton at Brooklands, achieving a blistering 106 miles per hour average speed and earning the British Motorcycle Racing Club's coveted Gold Star. Only 3 women in history had earned that award. Shilling was the second. Racing had taught her how engines failed under extreme stress, in high G turns, during sudden acceleration, at impossible lean angles. She had learned to feel what an engine needed, to anticipate its limits before any gauge could warn her. That intuition, forged on the racetrack, had made her the best carburetor specialist in Britain. And now, British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't handle the stress of combat. The solution had come to her in a flash of insight one January morning. It was simple physics. The float chamber flooded because fuel could flow unrestricted when gravity effectively reversed. So, what if you restricted the flow? Not completely, but just enough to prevent the surge. The engine would still get the fuel it needed, just not a catastrophic glut of it. The idea took physical form as a small brass disc with a precisely calculated hole in its center, designed to be installed in the fuel line just before the carburetor. It would limit the maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at full screaming throttle. She had machined the first prototype herself in the workshop. It was shaped like a small thimble, 0.125 inches in diameter, with a central hole of just 0.04 inches. Those dimensions were everything. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve for fuel at full power. She tested 17 different sizes before finding the perfect balance. Then, for the sake of practicality, she simplified the design to a flat washer, easier to manufacture, easier to install, and easier to replace. Bench tests confirmed her theory. The restrictor prevented flooding during simulated negative G conditions. But a laboratory simulation could never replicate the chaos of an aerial dogfight. She needed to test it on an actual aircraft under actual combat conditions. The problem was getting permission. Installing an unauthorized modification on an RAF fighter violated around 40 different regulations. If the restrictor failed and a pilot died, Shilling would be court-martialed, possibly even imprisoned. She made a calculated decision. She would skip asking for permission and hope she would only have to ask for forgiveness later. That morning at Kenley, she had 6 restrictors in her satchel and one very cooperative ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years. He had seen 19 pilots from his station die from engine failures. He didn't ask questions when Shilling showed him the small brass washer. He just nodded grimly and reached for his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad, its pilot running through his checks, the engine warming up. They had 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked with a surgeon's speed and precision. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and the carburetor. The restrictor slid perfectly into place. He welded it with a small butane torch, 60 seconds of intense work. The modification was completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Shilling inspected the weld. It was clean, solid, and professional. Squadron leader Davies would fly with the restrictor. He had no idea it was there. Shilling hadn't told him, hadn't told the squadron commander, hadn't told anyone at all except Sergeant Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation. There would only be a dead pilot and a small brass washer that should never have been there. The Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies completed his pre-flight checks. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature good, magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes. The fighter rolled forward, gathered speed, and lifted gracefully into the morning air. Shilling watched it climb, 800 feet, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet. The Hurricane banked south toward the channel. She raised a pair of binoculars, her hand steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She watched Davies climb to 15,000 feet, where 2 more Hurricanes joined him, forming a standard patrol section of 3. They flew toward Dungeness, a known hotspot for German fighter activity. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he would have to dive. The restrictor would either work or it would fail. Shilling waited on the tarmac, Cooper standing silently beside her. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the normal sounds of a fighter station at war continued. A fuel truck rumbled past, mechanics shouted technical jargon across the dispersal area. Shilling heard none of it. She was lost in calculation, mentally running through fuel flow rates and negative G durations. The math worked, but math wasn't combat. 40 minutes crawled by, then an hour. The radio remained silent. That could mean anything, no contact with the enemy, or contact so intense there was no time to report. Or it could mean Davies was already gone, his Hurricane a smoking crater in a French field. Then, at 0937, the radio crackled to life. A controller's calm voice cut through the tension. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Shilling raised her binoculars again. She saw them, 3 dark shapes against the pale morning sky. All 3 aircraft. There had been no losses. The Hurricanes entered the landing circuit, and Davis's plane touched down first. He taxied to his dispersal point, cut the engine, and climbed out. Shilling walked toward him, her heart pounding, her hands now visibly shaking. She had designed bombs before. She had tested countless engine modifications under controlled laboratory conditions, but she had never done anything like this. Never sent a man into combat to test an unauthorized, unproven part. Davis pulled off his helmet. He was smiling. That was wrong. That was unusual. Pilots didn't smile after combat patrols. They looked exhausted, haunted, drained. Davis looked exhilarated. Cooper, unable to contain himself, asked the question that hung in the air. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davis looked at Cooper. Then his gaze shifted to Shilling, then back to Cooper. "Best the Merlin's ever run," he said, his voice filled with a kind of astonished reverence. "Dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat." Shilling pressed him for details, needing to know exactly what happened. He explained that he'd spotted 2 Messerschmitt 109s at 14,000 feet. Possessing the altitude advantage, he had pushed his section into a steep 400-mile dive, the very maneuver that should have killed his engine. He felt the familiar negative G-forces lift him against his harness straps, but this time the Merlin kept running, roaring at full power through the entire dive. Davis closed to within 200 yards before the German pilot even saw him. He fired a 3-second burst, seeing strikes blossom on the Messerschmitt's wing root. The German fighter broke hard and fled for France. Davis had pulled up, climbed back to altitude, and the engine had performed flawlessly. It was the first time in 11 months that Davis had successfully pressed home a diving attack without his engine cutting out. He demanded to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Shilling told him everything. She explained the restrictor, the simple brass washer, the principle of fuel flow limitation. Davis stared at her for 5 long seconds, processing the information. Then he turned to Sergeant Cooper. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station," he commanded, "today." When Shilling explained it wasn't an authorized modification, Davis waved her concerns away. He didn't care about authorization, he cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kenly had lost friends to engine failures. 19 pilots from this station alone were dead in 6 months. Davis declared that if the brass wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war was won. Right now, his squadron needed working engines. By that afternoon, Cooper had installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes. Word spread through the station like wildfire. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with the modification. The results were unequivocal. 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks were successfully pressed against German fighters. Pilots reported that their Merlin engines ran perfectly, some even claiming they were getting more power at altitude. The news traveled fast. By March 18th, every squadron commander in 11 Group knew about the Kenly fix. They all wanted it, and they wanted it immediately. Shilling's phone rang incessantly, 14 calls in 2 days. Could she come to their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be manufactured? The problem was now one of supply. Shilling had machined the first 6 restrictors herself. Manufacturing thousands would require proper production facilities, raw brass stock, and precision machining equipment. She needed approval from the Air Ministry, she needed funding, and she needed it all yesterday. She got approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry, recognizing a potential game changer, fast-tracked her proposal, calling it a war-winning modification. Rolls-Royce received the production contract and began manufacturing 500 restrictors per week. Shilling assembled a small mobile team to tour the RAF stations and oversee the installations. Critically, the restrictor could be fitted without taking aircraft out of service. With German fighters still crossing the channel daily, Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons for even a day. By March 25th, the teams were ready. Shilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and a fresh supply of restrictors and headed north toward Biggin Hill, the busiest fighter station in 11 Group. The station commander, Group Captain Grice, had lost 7 pilots to engine failure in the past 2 months. He met her at the gate and demanded the installations begin immediately. The ground crews worked in shifts, 4 aircraft at a time, each installation taking a mere 12 minutes. Shilling supervised every single one personally, checking each weld, rejecting any part that didn't meet her exacting specifications. Pilots watched the process with intense interest. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a veteran of 41 missions who had experienced engine failure twice, asked Shilling how a simple washer could solve such a complex problem. She explained the physics of fuel flow and flow chamber dynamics. Lacey, an engineering graduate from Cambridge, understood immediately. Brilliant simplicity, he called it. The modification quickly earned a nickname, coined by Sir Stanley Hooker, a chief engineer at Rolls-Royce. With a touch of crude British humor, pilots began calling it Miss Shilling's Orifice. Shilling, who understood how military men dealt with stress, didn't mind. The nickname spread even faster than the restrictor itself. By April, every pilot in Fighter Command knew about it and demanded it. Some refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft was fitted with the modification. The results were stark and measurable. In March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks. Fighter Command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires, shooting down 61 German aircraft, a ratio of just 1.3 to 1. In April, after the restrictor was widely installed, engine failures during dives dropped to a statistically insignificant 0.4%. Fighter Command lost only 29 aircraft while destroying 94 German planes, transforming the kill-to-loss ratio to 3.2 to 1. The tactical advantage the Luftwaffe had enjoyed for months had vanished overnight. The restrictor, a stopgap solution, remained in service until the new pressure carburetors were finally introduced in 1943. But even then, many older aircraft kept Miss Shilling's Orifice. The pilots trusted it. Ground crews knew it. It worked. Beatrice Shilling's work continued throughout the war, solving dozens of other critical engineering challenges. She received the Order of the British Empire in 1948 and continued her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969. Yet her most famous contribution remained her first. Years later, Keith Maddock, a chief engineer during the war, stated it plainly. Beatrice Shilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. Her legacy endures, not just in museums or building names, but in the lesson her invention teaches. It serves as a timeless reminder that sometimes the course of history isn't changed by grand armies or sweeping strategies, but by a single, brilliant mind, a bit of brass, and a solution so simple it was nothing short of revolutionary.